Okay, welcome back to the Greeks. So let's go back to the PowerPoint here. Um, so um, I should mention there's a few different kings involved in all this. So we're going to meet another fellow named Xerxes. So when the rebellion originally begins, it's Darius, but then we're going to get into Xerxes. And Xerxes, uh, when he goes to war with the Greeks, this is a pretty big deal. Okay, so the reason the year 480 is so important is because this is when Greece is invaded. The Persian king, and he comes himself, launches a pretty major invasion of Greece. He's going to conquer those Greeks who started these rebellions throughout his empire, and he's going to just take the fight to them and nip this in the bud and maybe conquer this territory for himself while he's at it. At the very least, punish the Greeks for starting these revolutions, and and basically, teach them who's boss. You'll notice there's parts here where you can cross over to Greece really easily. So that's what he does. He takes advantage of these crossing points. He builds a bridge of boats that allows him to cross over, and he marches his army through here. He also has a whole navy too of people who are really skilled with ships. He hires out a lot of the time. He hires out the Phoenicians and other folks like that who are more talented shipbuilders. He just pays them a bunch of money to be these sort of naval mercenaries. And so he gathers his army and his navy and he invades Greece. Now the Greeks, they look back on the Persian Wars as a time of glory for Greece because they are, spoilers, successfully able to hold the Persians off and keep from being destroyed absolutely. But at the same time, it's also a really traumatic time for Greece because the Persians do succeed in their invasion. In particular, they burn a lot of cities down, including Athens. So Athens, there's a central sort of site in Athens known as the Acropolis. This means the top of the city in Greek, or the highest point in the city. And what is it? It's a big, beautiful rock with a lot of cool temples on it, and a lot of cool ruins on it today. And when you've got a big rock, this is a great place to build a city. Because you have a fortified place where you can get up on the hill and protect your hill from people who are going to try and attack and invade you. And early in Greek history, this was other Greek city-states. This is kind of the thing with city-states is that, they're always fighting each other. So this is a good, convenient location the Athenians had. And there seems to have been settlement at this location from Mycenaean times. We know that there are some tiny, tiny Mycenaean ruins that are left over around the gateway area here. We don't know how big a Mycenaean city it was. It seems like not to have been one of the more important ones, but it was connected to that whole culture, and it collapsed when they did. But it recovered as well. And so by the time we get into the Archaic period, Athens is an important city again, and the Greeks are building temples and stuff again. They have this cool new gate, and they have a couple of temples on the site. One of them is the Temple of Athena. The Greeks in Athens are all about Athena. She is the patron goddess of Athens. That's where we get the name. It's possible that she is connected to this rock and that, maybe the rock came first and the goddess came afterward. That's something people have debated about. But she is the one who's being worshipped as these temples as the protector of the city. And we do have some remains from these temples. They were buried pretty deeply under a lot of rubble, but when archaeologists really started investigating this area, they found them. We have this cool figure who is like a three-bodied snake guy, or three snake people who are all entwined together. Some people think this represents the different groups in Athens, the people from the city, from the hills, and from the shore of the sea. That's one theory anyway. And so this is a cool monster guy we've got on there. And what was probably on the original temple was a fight between the gods and the giants, which is a very traditional thing to depict in Greek art. But the Athenians version would have focused on Athena. So here Athena is with her robe of snakes She's said to have a sort of breastplate with Medusa's head on it that has the power of Medusa's head. Um, and that is one part of what makes her so powerful. And here she is defeating a fallen giant, something like that. And she has these snakes woven into it. But yeah, the Persians come in and they burn this whole place down. And you can see today the uncovered foundations that were left behind. Basically, the Greeks asked the oracle of Delphi, who could give you prophecies. The Athenians specifically asked the oracle of Delphi, "What should we do to avoid being, destroyed by the Persians?" And at first, the oracle gave them a really bad prophecy and said, or a prophecy that was really negative, I mean, and said, "You're doomed. Flee to the hills. Save yourselves." And the Athenians said, "We want a second opinion." And the oracle said, "Okay. Here's what you do. You hide behind the wooden wall." And the Greeks puzzled over what the wooden wall meant. But eventually they decided it was going to be a wall of ships. The Athenians decided a wall of ships to defend themselves against the Persian ships. And so that's what they did. And they took all the people out of the city and they fled. So fortunately, nobody really died. They all sort of, what's the term I'm looking for? They evacuated. But the Persians did smash up all their old temples. And so for a while, the Greeks who had their cities burned down made a pledge not to rebuild those temples. But eventually they decided that they would. But you could see that this left a kind of scar in the Greek consciousness that they had been attacked and damaged in this way by this enemy who they were fighting. That's a scary thing. It would be, America has not really been invaded since the British back in the day. Back in the War of 1812, it would be a pretty scary thing if America was invaded by another country in a war. And so for the Greeks, this was the Athenians and other cities that were conquered like this, or not conquered, but attacked like this. You can see that this was a pretty scary moment. And so it was something that they thought about quite a lot. And what I think is so interesting is that it really reshaped the way the Greeks thought of themselves. For instance, let's take a look at the temple that they built when they really did start rebuilding, and this is the Parthenon. So the Parthenon is this giant temple to Athena that is found today at the Acropolis in Athens. It's debatable whether it's actually a temple. In some ways, it's more like a treasury, but Athena has a giant statue there, or did at one point, and was really deeply worshipped in that whole sort of general complex. So it's kind of her watching over the city. It's kind of a little bit of a temple and a treasury. But let's look at the art that they put on this temple treasury. So this is a mythological scene known as the Centaurs versus the Lapiths. So the Lapiths were a group of people, just a random Greek tribe from mythology, probably not a real group of people. But the story was that they had a wedding. One of their number was getting married. It was actually marriage of a mortal and a god. And they invited the centaurs. This turns out to be a big mistake because centaurs are actually not very nice in mythology. We're used to like the friendly centaurs who know things about medicine and stuff like that. Well, there's only one centaur like that, and his name is Chiron. And he's the exception rather than the rule. He's the one nice centaur, or maybe like one of two. And so they invited him, and unfortunately, they also invited his whole family, and that turned out to be a bad idea because the centaurs got really drunk and they started trashing the place and trying to run off and kidnap the women. It was just a really bad thing. So the Lapiths at the wedding had an impromptu mini war or skirmish with these centaurs and drove them off. And so this is what's being depicted here is the Lapiths over on the right and the centaurs over on the left. Centaurs, they're half animal people. They have this association with wildness and being out of control. And so the centaur is like trying to strangle the guy, but he looks pretty calm about it. He's got this calm expression, whereas the centaur is bearded and hairy and part horse. So you've got this wildness versus this calmness. So let's think about that in the context of this was a temple / treasury put up after the Persian Wars and kind of to commemorate the Persian Wars in a lot of ways, because Athens was in a leadership position after this, and their leadership was specifically to lead people against Persians. So yeah, let's think about this. Why this story? Why are these images chosen? And maybe you have some thoughts about this yourself. But what I think is the deal here is, who do these map to? Who do these characters correspond to? Well, here we have a very calm, very beautiful, very handsome Greek person. And then over here we have a wild, crazy, out of control force that's trying to attack this Greek. I think it seems pretty clearly a parallel to the Greeks versus the Persians. And so in this, we see how the Greeks think of the Persians and how the Greeks think of themselves. So the Greeks are thinking, oh, we are calm, we are rational, we are noble, we are beautiful. And our enemies are these outsiders. They are foreign, they are wild and out of control, and they are a destructive, dangerous force. That's the kind of stuff that we seem to be working with here. And this is kind of a time period where the word barbarians comes into play. So barbarians, you think of a barbarian, you think of some sort of wild man or a warrior or, a Viking or something like that. Barbarians originally just means foreigners in Greek. It specifically refers to anybody who can't speak Greek. So a lot of us would probably be barbarians by that reckoning. Barbarians are people who go bar, 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 meaning the Greeks can't understand them. So that's the idea of barbarians originally. And barbarians are very often, foreign or outsiders in some way. They are very often being denigrated for being wild and being dangerous and being, out of control. And that's how the Greeks seem to think about these Persians. And the other interesting thing about this is that the Greeks are defining themselves in a way too. Up until this point, you didn't really have a concept of Greece per se. You had different city-states, and they all had their own kind of national identity. They had like the Athenian identity or the Spartan identity or the Theban identity or the Corinthian identity, and they were going to war with each other. And then suddenly they get in this fight with these outsiders from far away, this terrifying, intimidating giant empire over here. And they say, well, wait a minute, we need to band together because we've got more in common with each other than we do with those guys. So this is kind of the time period where the Greeks invent the idea of Greekness in a way. They define themselves as all part of one thing that has things in common, rather than these guys over here. And before this time period, they might not have done that. So that's why the start of this classical period is a pretty big deal. And this invasion is a pretty big deal because that solidifies it in their minds, their identity. And let's see. Oh, there was something else I was going to say here, but that's okay. One thing I want to point out is that you continue to see this all over Greece. People love making statues of the fight of the centaurs and the lapiths. You again see the same confrontation, again with these calm-looking Greeks and these wild, out-of-control centaurs. And take a look at this. So here is the Brandenburg Gate that is in Berlin. This was made by Napoleon when he conquered the region. It was made, more than 2,000 years later. And what do we have on here? We have centaurs and Greeks. We have centaurs versus lapiths. So this idea of, we are the beautiful, noble, smart, intelligent, rational people, and our enemies are the wild, out of control, barbarian people. That idea continues to be something that a lot of cultures use to think about themselves. And that's, it's a basic form of bias against another culture. And it gives people a way of propping themselves up and saying, oh, aren't we so much better than those guys? And that is something that continues on in history because the Greeks have this legacy, and this idea of us versus the other guys has just such this legacy. Um, so yeah, I think this is a pretty big deal, pretty important in terms of the Greek concept of themselves. Oh yeah, what I was going to mention is just a little vocabulary look here. So the Greeks, our word Greeks is a Roman word, um, is the Roman name for these folks, and because we got biased by Romans, we tend to call them Greeks. But what they called themselves was Hellenes. It seems like this archaic period is really where the concept of Hellenes starts, and then it really solidifies in this time period after 480, when everybody's thinking it's us Hellenes versus the Persians. Back during the Mycenaean time period, we don't know what the Mycenaeans called themselves, but one possibility might be Achaeans. Um, Achaeans being what the works of Homer call this group that would later come to be known as the Greeks. But there was no concept of Greeks yet, or even of Hellenes yet. There was only the Achaeans. And if the Mycenaeans did think of themselves as Achaeans, they only occupied part of the region that we think of as Greece today. So yeah, different conceptions of this sort of national identity and things that are had in common. But it really comes to the forefront after the Persian Wars. And there's different conceptions of this too that you see with the different names. Um, yes, and losing my train of thought again, but that's okay. Going back to the invasion map here, if we zoom in a little bit, we can see that there are some particularly significant battles. I'm not going to ask you guys to remember them all, but the Greeks have some victories at sea led by the Athenians and some victories on land. And the most significant people for the victories on land are the Spartans. You might have heard of the battle at Thermopylae. So the Spartans make a really big deal out of the Battle of the Thermopylae, that they were able to hold off the Persians for a little while and keep them from getting down to the rest of Greece, and that only 300 Spartans were able to hold them off this giant Persian army. And that's kind of true, but also kind of propaganda from the Spartans. They didn't intend to get into such a dire situation, and it actually involved a few mistakes on their part. But Thermopylae ends up being remembered as one of the really big, important battles of the war. Other ones are the Battle of Marathon, where the guy who was the messenger had to run all the way to Athens to tell them that they'd won the battle, and that's where we get the term marathon from. Salamis, and some of these are happening right outside of Athens. So these battles are particularly important for places like Athens and Sparta. But the Greeks managed to hold off the Persian kings long enough, the Darius and Xerxes, long enough that they conclude it isn't worth it, and they basically go back home. But the tragedy is that the Greeks don't get what they originally wanted, which was for these Ionian cities to be free. Basically, the Ionian cities have to accept that they're paying high taxes to the satrap over here. And so things end up peaceful for now. But the Greeks are always going to remember that they could have to go to war with Persia again and think, maybe we should take the fight to them. So that's kind of their thought for the future. So Herodotus is the one who fills us in on most of this. And along the way, he also fills us in on some other cultures as well. He spent some time on the Persians. He also spent some time on the Scythians. So the Scythians are kind of cool and worth knowing about. They are from this north of Greece, north of the Black Sea area. We don't know too much about them. They were nomadic people. They went around with their horses and they traveled to different locations, and didn't stay in any one place for long. But what the Greeks knew the Scythians for was being archers and horse riders. Very often when Greeks would take slaves, they would buy them from Scythians who had captured each other in battle. So a lot of slaves in Greece were Scythians. And so they had this sort of foreign quality to them that they used to sort of make them other and not very Greek. But in other passages, in Herodotus, for instance, you can tell that he respects the Scythians and tries to understand their customs and how they're different from those of the Greeks. Like I said, the Scythians are very often depicted with these pointy hats, This is one style of pointy hat. The garden gnome one is another style of pointy hat. Scythians are also depicted as wearing trousers. So for Greeks, wearing trousers is the sign of being a barbarian, wearing pants in any way, because the Greeks wear chitons. That's basically the Greek equivalent of a toga, these long robes that have no pant legs in them. And so you need these pants to ride horses. And the Greeks didn't do that much horse riding. Or if they did, they were able to ride them in togas, and they didn't, specialize like the Scythians did to make things easier. So that's another reason we're all barbarians, is because we wear pants. But Herodotus goes into the Scythians quite a lot as well. And one thing I find really interesting about the Scythians is that they might have inspired the myth of the Amazons. Because we've looked at Scythian graves, and it seems like Scythians, their warriors were more often women than you see in other parts of the world. I think it's about like 1/3 women in the tombs that we found are skeletons of women. And so these tombs of great warriors who, rode horses and were buried with their loot and their treasure, a lot of them were women. And that's pretty cool. And so the thinking is that this inspired this idea in mythology, in Greek mythology, of these warrior women who were, who were an example in the mythology of, again, barbarians, outsiders. Ooh, wouldn't it be so wild if there was this culture that was ruled by women warriors? Oh, that would be so strange. But a lot of things they have in common with the Scythians. And so people think that's probably the inspiration there. And again, they have those trousers. So trousers in Greek pants are thought of as a very girly thing. So that's worth bearing in mind. But yeah, this gives us some insight into Greeks looking at other cultures. And the weird thing is the Greeks would sometimes try and depict other cultures in ways that made them look more masculine, like with the Persians being centaurs, but other times they would depict other cultures in ways that they were, looking more feminine. And so these girly warriors, some people also think that they were influenced by trying to make the Persians sound more girly and not very masculine in the way that Greek men are men and things like that. There's also both Persians and Scythians had archers, which was something that wasn't super popular in Greece. There were archers sometimes, but not super common. And archery was, because of this, thought of as something that was girly and not very manly. The real Greek warrior carries a spear and a shield. And sometimes a sword. So archery is girly, pants are girly, and centaurs are wild men unless they're girly Persians. It's all connected, but it doesn't necessarily have to make coherent sense. What it's really all about is saying, these guys are too extreme, they're too weird, but not like us. We have everything figured out, and we are the rational, noble, beautiful people. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to say about the Persian Wars. So I will meet you guys in the discussion question. I'll take a look at what you guys have to say there. Let's think about, how the Greeks thought about their own identity and who they were as a people during this time period. And then we'll move into more classical stuff that the Greeks are famous for. All right, see you later.